The grand, ancient castle loomed over the kingdom, darkened by clouds and mystery. King Edward, a ruler feared by his own people, sat in his throne room, brooding over his fate. His advisors had been persistent, urging him to marry the common girl, Isabella, a marriage for political gain to save the kingdom from an impending war with a neighboring nation. Edward had no choice, despite his contempt for the idea. His kingdom, his bloodline, depended on this. Isabella, a young woman from a poor village, had no idea what fate had in store. She was an ordinary girl, orphaned, and living with relatives who struggled to make ends meet. Little did she know, she was about to be thrust into a world of wealth, power, and royal expectations. The marriage was an arranged one, but something in her heart stirred, knowing the life she once knew would vanish in an instant. As the royal ceremony drew near, a quiet tension filled the air. Would Edward see her as a mere pawn, or could there be something more between them? The thought gnawed at Isabella's mind as she prepared for the event that would change her life forever. The future of the kingdom rested on this union, but for Isabella, it felt like the start of an unknown chapter, one she had no choice but to live. The day of the wedding arrived, and Isabella was led to the grand hall, her heart racing with anticipation and fear. She had no idea what her future would hold, but her life was about to change forever. Dressed in a delicate gown that contrasted her humble beginnings, she walked toward the altar, trying to ignore the eyes of the courtiers who watched her every move. Edward stood at the altar, his regal presence overwhelming. His cold, calculating gaze scanned the room, but his eyes faltered when they met hers. Isabella was not what he had imagined. She was not of noble birth, not the refined lady his advisors had suggested, but something about her sparked a fleeting curiosity. Yet he quickly suppressed it, reminding himself of the duty he was bound to. As she knelt before him, the tension between them was palpable. Edward's voice was formal, distant, as he recited the vows. He had not wanted this union, but his kingdom's survival depended on it. Isabella, feeling the weight of his indifference, fought the urge to run. But deep down, she knew she had to play her part in this grand political game. The ceremony ended with a kiss on her forehead, a cold gesture that sent shivers down her spine. No words were exchanged between them as the new couple retreated to their chambers, the distance between them growing with each step. Isabella, her eyes downcast, followed Edward to their chambers. She couldn't shake the feeling that this union was more of a trap than a marriage. Edward, on the other hand, couldn't shake the thought of Isabella. She was not what he had expected. There was an untamed spark in her, a fire that he hadn't seen in anyone from the noble courts. But he quickly pushed that thought aside. This was not a love story. This was politics. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, especially with a woman who was nothing more than a piece in a game he had no choice but to play. Inside their shared chamber, the tension was thick. Isabella stood by the window, looking out over the vast kingdom, unsure of her place in it. Edward, meanwhile, stood by the fireplace, his back turned to her as he stared into the flames. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was deafening. As the night drew on, Isabella couldn't help but wonder, would she ever be more than just a pawn in this royal game? And would Edward ever see her as more than a political tool? Days passed in silence. Isabella spent her time in the castle's lavish halls, feeling like a stranger in a world that wasn't hers. King Edward, though present, remained distant, his cold demeanor never changing. However, something unexpected began to happen. One evening, as Isabella wandered through the garden lost in thought, she heard a soft voice. "I didn't expect you to come here," Edward said, standing by the fountain, his posture relaxed for the first time. "The others—" He hesitated, then continued. "They think the queen should stay in the royal chambers, away from the common spaces." Isabella smiled slightly, a small act of rebellion. "I am no queen, just a girl from a poor village." For the first time, Edward noticed the sorrow in her eyes. His heart, though still guarded, began to soften, but he couldn't let his emotions show. A king couldn't afford to be vulnerable, especially not with a woman who was nothing more than a political alliance. The following week saw small moments of change. He would sometimes pass her in the castle and nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. She too began to see Edward in a new light, not just as a cold monarch, but as someone burdened by the crown. One night, as they sat across from one another during dinner, Edward finally spoke more candidly. "I never wanted this marriage," he admitted, his voice low. "But it was my duty." Isabella was silent for a moment, then replied, "We all have our duties, don't we?" Her words lingered in the air, and Edward, though reluctant, began to wonder about the woman before him. She was far more than the political pawn he had imagined. Slowly, as they began to speak more, they found common ground, a slow but steady bond forming. One evening, when the court was away, Edward invited her to join him for a walk in the gardens. There, away from the eyes of the palace, they shared stories about their lives before the crown, lives they had left behind. Edward spoke of his childhood, how his parents had ruled with an iron fist, and how he had never been allowed to choose his own path. Isabella, in turn, spoke of the simple joys of her village life, the sound of the river at night, the taste of fresh bread, the laughter of children running in the fields. For the first time since their marriage, they shared a real, unguarded moment. Edward found himself smiling genuinely, for the first time in a long time. Isabella, too, felt a strange warmth grow between them. This wasn't love, at least not yet, but it was something that had the potential to grow. In the days that followed, they began to spend more time together, talking about their hopes, their fears, their dreams. Their connection was still fragile, but it was undeniable. Edward started to see Isabella in a new light, not as a pawn, but as a partner. And Isabella began to understand that beneath Edward's cold exterior, there was a man who had been shaped by duty, by a life he had never chosen. Yet despite these growing feelings, both knew that their bond was still precarious. The court still watched them, and they were still bound by duty. The weight of their respective roles, Edward as king, Isabella as his bride, remained heavy, and neither could escape the reality of their positions. But in those quiet moments together, away from the pressure of the crown, there was a spark of something more. It was a crisp evening when the storm finally broke. A messenger arrived at the castle with urgent news, a letter sealed with the royal crest of a neighboring kingdom. Edward's face, usually unreadable, was now taut with tension as he read the contents aloud to his closest advisors. The neighboring kingdom, once an ally, had broken the treaty they had signed years ago and was planning to attack. This was no mere skirmish. It was war. But the worst part of the letter was yet to come. The message contained a demand. Edward's marriage to Isabella had been orchestrated, but not for the reasons he had been led to believe. The neighboring kingdom had arranged the union as a political move, knowing it would destabilize Edward's reign. They believed that by forcing him into a marriage with a poor, unknown girl, he would be distracted, weakened, and unable to defend his kingdom. The revelation sent shockwaves through the court. Edward stood in stunned silence, the weight of betrayal heavy on his shoulders. He had been played, a pawn in a game he had never agreed to. The woman he had married, the one who had slowly started to carve a space in his heart, was no longer just a political tool. She was a key piece in a much larger conspiracy. Isabella was summoned to the throne room. When she entered, Edward could hardly look at her. The woman he had grown close to was now a symbol of everything he had been deceived into. The truth was too much to bear. How could he have been so blind? "Isabella," he began, his voice tight. "Do you have any idea what you've gotten us into?" Isabella's heart raced. She had no idea what he was talking about. She had been a pawn in this game, but so had he. As she walked toward him, her face a mask of confusion, she caught sight of the tension in his eyes. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't want this marriage either." Edward's expression softened for a moment, but it was fleeting. "The kingdom is on the brink of war because of our union. The very thing I was trying to avoid has now been set into motion." A mix of confusion and guilt flooded Isabella's heart. She had always known her marriage to Edward was not out of love, but this new revelation shattered her world. Had they both been mere pieces on a chessboard, manipulated by others? She looked at Edward, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear I didn't know." Edward's gaze softened for a fleeting moment, but his duty remained his priority. He had to protect his kingdom. "Then we must act quickly. We have no time for hesitation. We must prepare for war." The tension between them was unbearable. Edward, now deeply conflicted, struggled with the duality of his feelings. He had grown to care for Isabella, but his duty as king outweighed everything else. He couldn't let her, no matter how much she had become a part of his life, distract him from saving his people. But as the days passed, the situation only grew worse. Isabella, devastated by the truth, began to withdraw. She had been thrust into a world where she had no control, where she was nothing but a pawn. And now she realized she had been the pawn in a game between two warring kingdoms. She had come to care for Edward, but now she couldn't help but wonder if it had all been part of a plan from the start. One evening, in the quiet of the palace, Isabella found herself standing before the mirror, her veil draped over her face. The veil, which had once symbolized the mystery of their marriage, now felt like a weight on her shoulders. As she gazed at her reflection, a soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Edward entered, his face somber. "Isabella," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "There's something I need to tell you." Her heart raced, her stomach twisting in anticipation. She turned to face him, the veil still covering her face. "What is it?" Edward hesitated, then took a step closer. "I've always seen you as a pawn in this game," he admitted. "But the more time I spend with you, the more I realize you're not just that. I've started to care for you." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Could this be the truth? Did he feel something for her beyond the politics? She didn't know what to say. The emotions she had kept buried began to rise to the surface. Edward gently lifted her veil, his hands trembling slightly. When he looked at her, his eyes were filled with a mixture of regret and hope. "I'm sorry for everything, Isabella," he whispered. "This was never supposed to be this way." In that moment, something changed. Despite the betrayal, despite the chaos surrounding them, there was a bond between them, one forged through shared pain, understanding, and now, perhaps, something more. But with war on the horizon and treachery closing in, would their newfound connection be enough to survive the storm that was coming? The weeks that followed the revelation were filled with tension and uncertainty. Edward, now burdened with the truth, focused all his energy on preparing for war, but his heart was divided. The political games he had been forced to play had taken a toll, and yet Isabella's presence lingered in his thoughts. They had shared something real, something human, amidst the politics and lies. But could that be enough to change the course of their futures? Isabella, too, was lost in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Her marriage to Edward had started as a tool of manipulation, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. But as they spent more time together, she realized she had grown to care for him. The man who had once been a cold, distant king was now someone she could see beyond the throne. But as war loomed closer, she wondered if their bond was strong enough to withstand the chaos that was about to unfold. The day of the battle arrived. The armies gathered outside the kingdom's walls, the air thick with the scent of fear and anticipation. Edward stood at the front, his armor gleaming in the sunlight, his face set in determination. He had to protect his kingdom, no matter the cost, but his eyes constantly flickered back to the castle, to Isabella, the woman who had unexpectedly become the key to his heart. Isabella, standing in the royal palace, watched from a high tower as the armies marched. Her heart ached, with a strange mix of pride and fear. She had no part to play in the battle, but everything she held dear was at stake. As she stood there, a figure approached from behind. It was Edward. "I'm leaving for the front lines," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his emotions. "This battle will decide the fate of the kingdom and of us." Isabella nodded, her heart pounding. She had never imagined a life like this, caught between love, duty, and the weight of a crown. But now, in this moment, she realized something. No matter how this battle turned out, they had shared something rare, something worth fighting for. "I'll be waiting for you," she said, her voice soft but firm. Edward looked at her for a long moment, then turned and walked out to the battlefield, his form becoming a distant figure as he disappeared into the chaos. Isabella stood there, her thoughts a storm within her. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for certain. She had come to love this man, despite everything. The battle raged for hours. The sounds of swords clashing, the cries of soldiers, and the roar of war filled the air. Isabella paced in the palace, unable to sit still. Every second felt like an eternity. She wanted to be out there, with Edward, helping him fight for their future. But all she could do was wait. Finally, as the sun began to set, the gates of the castle opened, and Edward returned, weary and bloodied but victorious. The kingdom had been saved, and the threat of war had been quelled. The enemies had been driven back, and the people rejoiced. But the victory came at a cost. Edward's injuries were severe, and he was carried into the palace, where Isabella rushed to his side. His face was pale, his breathing labored, but he was alive. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "You're here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You're still here." "Of course I am," she replied, tears filling her eyes. "I'll always be here, Edward." They locked eyes, and for the first time, the weight of the world seemed to lift from both of their shoulders. The war had ended, but their battle, one of trust, of love, of understanding, was just beginning. They had been tested in ways neither of them could have foreseen, but they had come through it stronger, more connected. As Edward recovered from his injuries, Isabella took her place by his side, not as a pawn, not as a political tool, but as his equal. The kingdom, once on the brink of destruction, had been saved, and so too had their relationship. What began as a marriage of convenience had transformed into something much deeper. The royal court, once filled with whispers of doubt and political maneuvering, now buzzed with hope. Isabella and Edward were no longer just king and queen. They were partners, united not by duty alone, but by something far stronger: love. As they stood together on the balcony of the palace, watching the sunset over the kingdom they had fought so hard to protect, they knew that no matter what challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. And for the first time, both Edward and Isabella felt that they had finally found their place in the world, not as rulers, not as pawns, but as two people, bound by a love that had been forged in the fires of war and betrayal. The future was uncertain, but together they would face it, and that was enough.